There are various questions that we can ask when we open the New Testament and find these things called Gospels. One of the first and most important, which I have dealt with in various other courses and places and books, is who was Jesus and what can we say about Jesus historically and theologically and in every other possible way. All of that is now taken for granted, but there's another set of questions which are in some ways just as interesting, which is, granted we have 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, why did people decide to tell the story of Jesus this way? I think that's particularly appropriate as a question when we come to Matthew's Gospel, because, as we shall see, Matthew has structured his Gospel very carefully, and he's done so in such a way as to make it a work of art. And though, of course, he is telling the story of Jesus and telling us a great deal about Jesus' teaching, not least, one of the things we go to Matthew for, we find that the way he has structured that tells us a great deal about what he thinks it all means. So in this course, we're going to be looking particularly at that question. Why has Matthew done it like this? How has he arranged his material? Now, one of the safest ways of discovering the meaning of any book, or actually any piece of music or any great work of art, is to look at the framing, the beginning and the ending. And in Matthew's case, this is particularly interesting because just as John begins his gospel by saying, "In the beginning was the Word," and anyone who knows the Bible knows that "in the beginning" takes you straight back to the book of Genesis. Does John think he's writing a new Genesis? Well, in a sense, yes, he does. So with Matthew, the opening words in Greek are biblos genesios, literally translated book of Genesis. And when he says this is the book of the Genesis of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham, he is echoing not only the title of the first book of the Bible, Genesis, but also a phrase which occurs a couple of times early on in Genesis, the book of the generations of the heavens and the earth. Genesis 2 verse 4, the book of the generations of Adam, Genesis chapter 5 verse 1. And there are other lists of generations as well, but those are the 2 most prominent. And particularly the first one is important because, as we'll see, Matthew has a great deal to say about heaven and earth and the way in which God's kingdom is coming and God's will be done through Jesus and through his followers on earth as in heaven. So the book of Genesis of Jesus the Messiah, that takes us right back to the beginning, the Genesis, the generation of heaven and earth. But then when we go to the end of Matthew's Gospel, we find a clear echo of that same theme. Jesus talking to his disciples, having been crucified and having been raised from the dead. Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 to 20, a stunning conclusion to the book. Jesus came forward and addressed them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Matthew is telling us something about the creation of heaven and earth and then the redemption of heaven and earth because Jesus is now in authority over it. So Matthew is saying this story of Jesus that I'm about to tell you is the concentration, the fulfillment, the recapitulation, the encapsulation of the whole scripture of Israel. Those long, clunky English words don't really do justice to the artistic sense of what Matthew is doing. That you imagine taking the whole of Israel's scriptures, boiling them down, distilling them, and then saying, now, look at this story of Jesus and see where it was all going. Because, of course, people have often said, well, Matthew is very keen on the fulfillment of Scripture. He says several times, all this took place so that it might be fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet. We'll see a few of those in the early chapters. And people have sometimes said, Matthew's a bit heavy-handed the way he does that. But that's just the icing on the cake. That's just the little tip of the iceberg. What's underneath is this much larger sense of the whole canon of Israel's God-given scriptures now being concentrated in this person of Jesus. It is as though Matthew had been chatting with a friend of his who went on to write the letter to the Hebrews. In former times, God spoke to his servants by the prophets, but in these last days, he's spoken to us by a son. In other words, all of that is now focused, concentrated in sharp and clear form in the story of Jesus himself. And what are we told in Matthew chapter 1? We are told that Jesus is to be the Emmanuel, the one who is God with us. That's Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, quoting, of course, from the prophet Isaiah. Matthew 1:23, Jesus is the Emmanuel. And at the end of Matthew's gospel, we find Jesus himself saying, remember, I am with you always, even to the close of the age. So Matthew has bookended his gospel with Jesus being the Emmanuel, God with us, Jesus being the one who will be with his people. And that is both the bookending of Matthew and a further echo of 2 Chronicles, as well, of course, as many other passages. We think of the book of Exodus, where God calls Moses to go and liberate his people from Egypt. And Moses says, look, I can't possibly do this. Please send somebody else. And God says rather fiercely, I will be with you. And that I will be with you rings as a refrain. It's what God says to Joshua when Joshua is about to go into the promised land. It's what God says to various other leaders and kings. I will be with you. And now Emmanuel, God with us. And Jesus saying to all his followers, all of us, I am with you always, even to the end of the world, the close of the age.